If I stay here, I'll have to face something about myself that feels unbearable. Think about what repair requires. It requires acknowledging impact. It requires sitting in another person's pain without defending, minimizing, or escaping. It requires emotional presence. For someone with secure emotional wiring, that's uncomfortable but manageable. For someone with avoidant wiring, it feels like standing emotionally naked under a spotlight with no armor and no script. Shame convinces them that if you truly see them in that moment, the moment where they caused harm, you won't just be disappointed. You'll leave, or worse, you'll confirm their deepest fear that they are fundamentally incapable of being a safe, consistent partner. So they disappear first. This is why avoidants often rewrite the story internally. Not because they're malicious, but because shame demands escape. The mind searches for narratives that reduce self-exposure. It wasn't that serious. They're overreacting. The relationship was flawed anyway. These stories aren't about erasing you. They're about quieting an internal accusation that feels overwhelming. And here's the paradox that's hard to accept the more someone matters to an avoidant. The more intense the shame can be after they hurt them. Indifference doesn't produce this level of avoidance. Emotional significance does. But shame doesn't just silence accountability, it distorts communication. When shame is active, the brain shifts into self-protection mode. The nervous system prioritizes safety over connection. That's why you may see avoidants act oddly calm, detached, or even cold after doing something deeply hurtful. That calm isn't peace, it's suppression. It's a freeze response masquerading as confidence. This is also why apologies from avoidants, when they do come, often feel incomplete or overly intellectual. They may acknowledge facts without fully touching emotion. Not because they don't feel it, but because emotion is the gateway to shame, and shame feels like collapse. From a philosophical perspective, this pattern reflects a fractured relationship with the self. Avoidants often learned early that worth is conditional based on performance, independence, or emotional control. Vulnerability wasn't modeled as strength, it was treated as liability. So when they fail relationally, it's not just a relational failure, it's an existential one. It threatens the very strategy they used to survive. Now, it's important to say this clearly, understanding this does not excuse harm. Psychological insight is not moral permission. People are still responsible for the impact of their actions, but responsibility and understanding are not opposites. In fact, true accountability begins with understanding the forces at play. For the person on the receiving end of avoidant withdrawal, recognizing the role of shame can be grounding. It reframes the silence, not as proof of your unworthiness, but as evidence of their internal struggle. The distance is not a measure of your value, it's a measure of their capacity. And yet, here's where this insight becomes empowering rather than sentimental. If shame is what's being hidden, then chasing, pleading, or demanding explanations often backfires. Those responses, while human, can intensify the avoidant shame and push them further into retreat. Not because you're wrong, but because their nervous system interprets emotional pressure as threat. This doesn't mean you must accommodate avoidance or abandon your needs. It means you gain clarity about what you're actually dealing with. You're not negotiating with logic. You're interacting with a defensive system built around avoiding emotional exposure at all costs, and clarity changes how you move. Instead of asking, why don't they care enough to fix this? The more accurate question becomes, do they have the emotional capacity to face themselves right now? That question shifts power back to you. It helps you assess reality instead of chasing potential. Because here's the hard truths. Shame, when unaddressed, doesn't lead to growth, it leads to repetition. Avoidants who never confront their shame don't become safer with time, they become more practiced at disappearing. The pattern continues not because they want to hurt people, but because they never learn how to stay when discomfort arises. This is why healing, when it does happen, always involves learning to tolerate shame without collapsing. It involves realizing that making mistakes doesn't equal being defective. That repair is not humiliation, it's maturity. And until someone reaches that realization, no amount of love from the outside can substitute for that inner work. So if you're listening to this and recognizing someone in your life or recognizing yourself, understand this. Shame thrives in silence. It weakens when it's named, examined, and met with responsibility rather than avoidance. And here's the closing truth to carry with you. When someone hides after hurting you, they're often hiding from themselves, but you don't have to hide your worth while they do. After shame, the next layer that often drives avoidant behavior is fear, specifically fear of dependence and emotional exposure. This fear doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't say, I'm afraid of needing you. It disguises itself as logic, independence, and self-sufficiency. It says, I just don't need this, or I work better alone, or relationships shouldn't be this hard. And when someone has been hurt, that fear intensifies because repair requires exactly what avoidants are most afraid of, leaning in. For an avoidant, dependence doesn't feel like connection. It feels like loss of control. Somewhere early in life, they learned explicitly or implicitly that relying on others was risky. Maybe caregivers were inconsistent. Maybe emotional needs were met with dismissal. Maybe love came with strings attached. Whatever the source, the lesson was internalized deeply. Need equals vulnerability. And vulnerability equals danger. So they built a philosophy of self-containment. I'll handle it myself. I won't need too much. I'll stay in control. On the surface, this looks like strength. And in many areas of life, it can be. Avoidants are often competent, capable, high-functioning individuals. But relationally, this strategy has a cost because intimacy is not possible without mutual dependence. You cannot build real connection without allowing someone to matter to you in a way that could hurt. When an avoidant causes pain in a relationship, the fear of dependence becomes even sharper. Repair means acknowledging that the other person's feelings matter. It means admitting that the relationship itself matters. And that admission threatens the very identity they've constructed, an identity organized around not needing, not relying, not being emotionally exposed. So instead of saying, I need to fix this, the avoidance system says, I need to get out of here. This is why you'll often see avoidance minimize the importance of the relationship after conflict. They might subtly emphasize flaws, distance themselves emotionally, or frame separation as the most rational choice. Not because the connection suddenly lost meaning, but because meaning implies attachment, and attachment implies risk. From a nervous system perspective, this is not a conscious choice. It's a survival response. Emotional closeness activates attachment circuitry. For avoidance, that circuitry is paired with threat, not safety. The closer they get, the more their body signals danger. Heart rate increases, thoughts race, the urge to escape grows. So when repair is required, when closeness is unavoidable, the system defaults to what it knows, withdrawal. This is where many people misinterpret avoidant behavior as arrogance or emotional laziness. But what's really happening is internal overload. The avoidant is not choosing distance because it's easy. They're choosing it because it feels safer than staying and risking emotional exposure. They don't know how to regulate. Philosophically, This reflects a deep conflict between autonomy and connection. Healthy autonomy says I can stand on my own and choose to connect. Avoidant autonomy says I must stand alone to survive. One allows intimacy without losing self. The other experiences intimacy as self-erasure. So when an avoidant hurts someone, the fear is not just about being confronted. It's about being pulled into emotional dependence they don't feel equipped to manage. Repair conversations often involve emotions like sadness, disappointment, longing, and hope. These emotions invite bonding. They pull people closer. And for someone who associates closeness with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger, that pull feels terrifying. This is why avoidance may say things like, I don't want to be responsible for someone else's happiness, or I can't give you what you need. On the surface, these statements sound considerate, but underneath, they often reflect fear, not clarity. Fear of being needed, fear of being relied upon, fear of being exposed as insufficient. And here's the painful irony, the avoidance attempt to avoid dependence often creates exactly what they fear. Their withdrawal leaves the other person feeling abandoned, insecure, and in need of reassurance. The more the other reaches out, the more the avoidant feels overwhelmed. A cycle forms, one driven not by malice, but by mismatched nervous systems. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it shifts the focus from chasing explanations to recognizing limits. You cannot argue someone into emotional capacity. You cannot reason someone out of a fear that lives in their body. No amount of logic, reassurance, or patience will make vulnerability feel safe to someone who hasn't done the internal work to tolerate it. This doesn't mean avoidants are incapable of love. It means love, for them, often exists at a distance. They may feel deeply, but they struggle to stay present when feelings require action, repair, or sustained emotional availability. They want connection without the exposure that comes with it. A paradox that no relationship can resolve on its own. And for those on the receiving end, this is where discernment becomes essential. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Understanding fear does not mean tolerating avoidance indefinitely. You are allowed to want a relationship where emotional responsibility is shared, where repair is possible, where closeness doesn't require you to shrink your needs. When someone consistently avoids repair because it threatens their sense of autonomy, they're telling you something important about their readiness for intimacy. Not with words, but with behavior. So the question becomes not, how do I make them less afraid? But, what kind of connection am I willing to participate in? Because real intimacy is not about eliminating fear, it's about learning to move toward connection despite it. And here's the truth to leave with. If someone cannot risk emotional exposure with you, the limitation is not your need. It's their fear after shame and fear of dependence. We arrive at a third layer that often confuses people the most. The internal chaos that exists beneath the avoidance apparent calm. This is where the disconnect between what you see and what is actually happening inside them becomes the widest and the most misleading. From the outside, avoidants often appear composed after conflict. They seem steady, rational, unbothered. Sometimes they even look relieved, as if distance has brought them clarity. And for the person who's been hurt, this can feel devastating. You're sitting with emotion, confusion, and pain while they appear untouched. It's natural to assume that if someone were truly affected, you would see it. But what looks like calm is often not regulation, it's suppression. Avoidant nervous systems are trained to shut down emotional signals when intensity rises. This is not a character flaw. It's a learned survival strategy. Early on, many avoidants discovered that expressing distress didn't lead to comfort, it led to dismissal, overwhelm, or punishment. So they learn to disconnect from emotion rather than process it. Over time, that disconnection becomes automatic. When conflict or hurt occurs, their system doesn't move toward expression, it moves toward containment. Emotions don't disappear, they go underground. And underground, they don't resolve, they churn. This is why avoidants often experience a strange internal contradiction. On the surface, they tell themselves they're fine. Underneath, there's anxiety, restlessness, regret, and self-doubt. But because those feelings aren't consciously welcomed or articulated, they manifest indirectly through irritability, rumination, distraction, or sudden life changes that seem unrelated to the relationship. This internal chaos is exhausting. It is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The energy required to maintain the calm exterior is immense. And yet, because avoidants are often highly functional, no one sees the cost. They go to work. They socialize. They perform competence. Meanwhile, their inner world is fragmented, unresolved feelings colliding with a deep fear of emotional engagement. Philosophically, this reflects a split between being and feeling. Avoidants often prioritize control, coherence, and self-mastery. Feelings, especially intense relational ones, threaten that order. So instead of integrating emotion into identity, they isolate it. The self becomes something that manages emotion rather than experiences it. This is why avoidants can talk about emotions without actually being in them. They may analyze, explain, or intellectualize what happened.